At 7:13, routine still owned the room. Metal hummed behind walls. Someone checked a gauge, someone else moved a cart, and the building behaved the way useful buildings are supposed to behave. Warm, loud, in familiar ways, dependable. Then the silent giant let go. Not with a warning anyone outside could read in time, but with an instant rearrangement of force so violent that walls stopped being walls and distance stopped meaning safety. Brick became shrapnel. Glass turned into weather. Floors rose, folded, and vanished into dust. What looked, from the street, like a sudden act of destruction, was almost never sudden at all. It was stored power made ordinary for so long that people forgot it was still power. The blast was only the visible sentence at the end of a long paragraph written by design compromise, repeated strain, neglected inspection, in a culture that learned to live beside concentrated energy. Because concentrated energy made everything else possible. That is the first truth behind the silent giants. They spread because they worked. They solved problems that every growing city and every expanding workplace had to solve at the same time. Heat had to arrive on demand. Motion had to be reliable. Production had to continue regardless of daylight, weather, or the strength left in human hands by the end of a shift. A system that could sit indoors, answer immediately, and feed many kinds of work at once did not feel like a luxury. It felt like progress itself. It made rooms habitable, tools useful, schedules predictable, and output scalable. Once that happened, danger stopped looking like danger and started looking like overhead, something to be managed later because the machine was already woven into daily function. The more indispensable it became, the harder it was to question, and that dependence was the first hidden increase in risk. Dependence never stays local. Once one building proves a machine can carry heat, motion, or pressure more efficiently than older methods, another building copies it, then a street, then a district, then entire regions, built around the assumption that this invisible force will always be there when called. Workplaces organize around it. Services depend on it. Households learn to expect the comfort or convenience it makes possible, without ever seeing the full mechanism that provides it. That is how a useful system becomes a background condition of ordinary life. And once a city grows around that assumption, a single failure point stops being a private problem. It becomes a public event. One rupture inside one room can tear through adjacent walls, ignite secondary hazards, shut down nearby work, overwhelm local response, and scatter fear far beyond the original site. The silent giant does not have to be everywhere to affect everywhere. It only has to sit at the center of enough routines. Physically, these systems were impressive in a way that encouraged trust. They were built to look serious, built to appear equal to the burden placed on them. Thick metal, heavy shells, plates joined by seams, held under restraint, connected through fittings and passages meant to contain and direct force rather than merely endure it. Their size suggested stability. Their weight suggested permanence. Their regular shape suggested control. But efficiency always whispered into the design. Larger capacity meant more output from the same footprint. Thinner sections in the right place meant lower cost or faster heating. A seam that was good enough in one condition could be judged acceptable in another, even when repeated use would test it differently. A restraint could hold under normal load while quietly concentrating stress where no one wanted to look too closely. The machine did not need to be poorly made to be vulnerable. It only needed to be optimized for usefulness before it was fully understood as a long-term vessel for concentrated risk. From the operator's side, nothing about daily use felt abstract. It was a rhythm of inputs, adjustments, checks, and interpretation. You watched levels, listened for changes, responded to demand, compensated for fluctuation, and learned the personality of the machine the way people learn the mood of any system they depend on too heavily. One day it ran hot. Another day it lagged. Sometimes it answered slowly, sometimes too sharply. The operator was not controlling a simple on and off state. The operator was managing a living balance between heat, feed, pressure, timing, and human expectation. That meant normal use was inseparable from accumulating strain. Every cycle of warming and cooling asked the materials to expand and contract. Every shift in demand changed internal conditions. Every small irregularity tempted someone to say it was manageable because the machine was still producing. In that way, attention became both the safeguard and the trap. Constant human care made the system function, but it also encouraged the belief that vigilance could compensate for what design and material were already deciding in silence. Inside the calm exterior, the failure logic was never mysterious. It was merely invisible to anyone who mistook stillness for safety. Stored energy does not advertise itself. Repeated stress does not announce each increment. Metal can look intact, while fatigue advances through places the eye cannot judge in ordinary conditions. Corrosion does not need spectacle to matter. It only needs time, moisture, chemistry, and neglect. A joint that appears firm from the outside may already be losing margin at the exact point where stress is concentrated. A wall that feels solid to the hand may have been thinned by processes too gradual for routine intuition. And inspection itself carries a fatal gap. People often check for the obvious, while danger matures in the ordinary. If the machine starts every morning, if the room is warm, if production continues, if no one hears anything dramatic, apparent calm becomes evidence in its own defense. That is how degradation hides inside reliability. The system earns trust precisely while consuming it. The warnings, when they came, were almost always small enough to be domesticated by habit. A reading that drifted and then returned. A leak that left a stain and then seemed to stop. A sound that changed from a steady hum to a sharper note, only to be explained away by load, weather, or age. Maintenance crews recorded irregularities in the language of routine, because routine language is how organizations keep operating without admitting that something larger may be forming. A patch here, a tightening there, a brief shutdown, a replacement part judged close enough to normal. Each event, on its own, seemed survivable. That was the second great mistake. The warning pattern only becomes visible when signals are compared across sites, across months, across categories that institutions prefer to keep separate. But secrecy protects reputation, poor data sharing protects convenience, and isolated interpretation protects momentum. So the machine keeps its license to remain ordinary, even while the pattern is already assembling its case. Then the pattern begins to teach the same lesson through different forms of failure, and still the lesson is missed. Attempt number 1 looks like an exception. A seam opens under strain, and the explanation lands on bad luck, a flawed repair, or a single worker's judgment at the wrong moment. The machine is patched, the room is cleared, and everyone calls the event regrettable rather than revealing. Attempt number 2 looks different on paper, but not in principle. A restraint fails, a weak section gives way, or a pressure spike outruns the margin that management assumed still existed. Again, the evidence is narrowed until it can fit inside one convenient cause. Again, the broader design logic is spared. Attempt number 3 should end the denial, because by then the failures have arrived through different entry points and still produced the same outcome. Concentrated energy escaping confinement faster than the surrounding structure can survive it. By that stage, the real scandal is not that the machine can fail. It is that organizations kept treating each failure as local gossip when it was clearly a system speaking in a repeatable language. And when that language becomes catastrophe, the violence is mechanical before it is visual. Containment is lost at a point. Pressure finds a path. The path widens faster than judgment can follow. A rupture becomes fragmentation. Metal sections accelerate into walls, ceilings, adjoining rooms, and the bodies of people who never touched the controls. Brick is pushed outward. Beams are displaced. Floors no longer hold the lines they were built to hold. Windows do not simply break. They transmit the event across distance, turning nearby interiors into extensions of the blast. Heat, steam, fire, dust, debris, and collapsing masonry layer themselves into a single overwhelming sequence. What begins as a failure inside one machine becomes an attack launched by the building against itself. That is why city blocks can disappear without warning from the point of view of the street. The original source may be indoors, restrained, even hidden. The consequences do not stay hidden for a second. After the blast, the scale changes again. First there is casualty, then there is confusion, then there is the slower recognition that a neighborhood has lost not just people, but function. Emergency response overloads because the site is no longer a site. It is rubble, fire risk, unstable structure, obstructed access, severed service, panicked witnesses, and unanswered questions arriving at the same time. Nearby work stops whether or not those buildings were physically struck. Households are displaced by damage, by fear, or by the simple fact that infrastructure failed faster than anyone could understand what had failed. Wages disappear with the broken walls. Deliveries stall. Streets close. Rumor outruns verified information because rumor is faster than recovery. In the public mind, the event becomes both too big and too sudden to process. But in system terms, it is neither. It is the logical endpoint of dependence meeting concealed weakness under conditions that were treated as normal for too long. The legacy question is not why people feared the silent giants after events like that. The harder question is why rebuilding so often won over reform. The answer lives in incentives. A destroyed machine could be replaced more quickly than an entire culture of design, inspection, placement, and oversight could be rebuilt from the ground up. Insurance logic tends to price replacement more comfortably than full philosophical change. Owners benefit from restored function. Cities benefit from resumed activity. Workers need wages now, not after a long moral reckoning. And the people who paid the highest price were rarely the same people who made the investment decisions. That unequal distribution of benefit and harm is how dangerous systems survive their own disasters. If the gains are concentrated in one place and the losses are distributed across others, the call to rebuild sounds practical, responsible, even inevitable. Reform, by contrast, sounds expensive, accusatory, and slow. So the giant returns, sometimes improved, often renamed in paperwork, but still accepted because stopping entirely appears more disruptive than continuing carefully. Official explanations made that return easier by reducing broad design failure to narrow, digestible blame. A single careless operator, a defective component, a lapse in maintenance, a freak pressure rise. Those explanations were not always false. They were merely too small. They allowed institutions to sound decisive without confronting the larger indictment, that dangerous systems had been placed too close to ordinary life, that safeguards could be disabled or neglected without meaningful external challenge. That oversight was weak, where it mattered most, and that concentration of force inside occupied spaces was treated as acceptable so long as the machine delivered value. Convenience loves a single-point cause because a single-point cause promises a single-point fix. Replace the part. Retrain the person. Issue the notice. Reopen the room. What gets ignored is the architecture of vulnerability itself. The way design choices, placement choices, and accountability choices combine long before the first visible crack appears. Over time, improvements did come, and they mattered. Better materials held margin longer. Better joins reduced the number of easy failure points. Better understanding of stress, fatigue, and corrosion made inspection more than a ritual. Safer layouts increased distance between concentrated force and the people most exposed to it. Relief mechanisms, monitoring practices, and maintenance discipline improved the odds that warning signs would be read before they became headlines. These changes reduced frequency. They saved lives. They made the machine less casually lethal. But reduction is not removal. A safer version of a concentrated system is still a concentrated system. It may fail less often, fail smaller, or fail under narrower conditions. Yet the core problem remains the same. Too much stored power in one place, dependent on materials, care, interpretation, and institutional honesty, remaining better than average for longer than human systems usually sustain. The cycle finally began to break when a cheaper substitute changed the economics of power itself. Instead of storing so much force in one room and asking walls, joints, and people to live beside it, the newer model distributed energy across networks, across lines, across multiple points of delivery that reduced the catastrophic weight of any single failure. The exact form mattered less than the shift in logic. Concentration gave way to distribution. One giant source no longer had to sit at the heart of ordinary life in the same way. The new system could still fail, of course, but its failures were less likely to erase everything around the original machine in one shattering instant. Just as important, it was cheaper to scale, easier to place, and more adaptable to changing urban needs. Once the substitute won on both safety profile and economic convenience, the silent giant lost the argument it had survived for years. Obsolescence, more than outrage, finished what reform alone could not. What remains now is not only rubble in old photographs or scar tissue in old records. What remains is design philosophy. Standards exist because somebody once learned, too late, what happens when useful force is treated as harmless, simply because it has become familiar. Clearance rules, inspection routines, material requirements, redundancy, monitoring, separation of hazards from occupied space, independent oversight, and the refusal to let convenience define acceptable risk. None of that appears out of nowhere. Each rule is a memory, translated into procedure, so that memory does not have to return as disaster. That is the final lesson of the silent giants. They were not evil machines. They were successful machines, trusted beyond their margin, normalized beyond their logic, and defended beyond the evidence. The city block was erased in a second, but the conditions that erased it were assembled patiently, choice by choice. And if those choices are forgotten because modern systems feel quieter, cleaner, or more advanced, then the age of the silent giant is never truly over.